Joining on Zoom. If you'll just give us a moment for everyone to load into the session, we'll get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome. My name is Ken Levinson. I'm the Executive Director of WITA, coming to you today from our virtual conference room in Washington, D.C. We hope you are doing well and staying safe wherever you are. We're so glad you could join us this morning, and welcome back if you've been away the last few weeks, getting in the last of your summer break. We're hitting the ground running with our fall programming at WITA. Before we get started with today's program, we want to tell you about some of our upcoming programs. Tomorrow, September 10th, we have a very special event discussing the WTO with Pascal Lamy, the former Director General of the WTO, and Bob Zoellick, the former U.S. Trade Rep, President of the World Bank, along with Peter Allgeier, the former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative. We also hope that you or your colleagues can also join us for our intensive trade seminar, which takes place over 3 days, September 18, 21, and 22. We have a fantastic roster of speakers lined up to talk about how the U.S. trade policy apparatus functions and some of the key issues facing trade policymakers. Information on those events, including an interview with Trade Subcommittee Chair Earl Blumenauer and the launch of our Trade and Environment series, are available on our website, www.wita.org. I think this is our 32nd webinar since March, and one of our favorite traditions is to highlight some of the people you're in community with at today's events, even if you can't see their faces. So welcome today to Bo Lohr with the Alabama Department of Commerce, David Ornstein with Autodesk, Nancy Draper-Schaefer with BAE Systems, and Jennifer Sanford with Cisco. Welcome, Bo, David, Nancy, and Jennifer, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, after the discussion between the Congresswoman and Orit, you will have the ability to ask questions using the Q&A box on your bottom of your screen. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can. You should have received an email from us this morning with biographies for our speakers, so I won't go into a lengthy introduction. But I'd like to say a special welcome to our guests, Orit Frankel of the American Leadership Initiative and Congresswoman Stephanie Murphy. We're delighted to welcome you, Congresswoman, to the WITA platform. The issues of national security and trade have always been linked, often for better, but sometimes for worse. And we're delighted to welcome you today to help put that discussion in a modern 21st century context. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us again today, and we hope you and your family are staying safe and well. Thanks, Orit. Take it away.
Thank you, Ken, and Diego and WITA for your partnership on this event. The American Leadership Initiative, or ALI, is creating a new vision and policy agenda for restoring American global leadership. We are working with elected officials, their staffs, and a diverse group of thought leaders, including business and civil society. You can learn more by going to our website, which is american-leadership.org. Thank you, Congresswoman Murphy. You've been a longtime friend of ALI, which we appreciate, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. I know it's been a little insane.
Well, it's great to be with you.
Yeah, and Congresswoman Murphy has represented, and especially since we can't meet in person these days. Congresswoman Murphy has represented Florida in Congress since 2016. She's a member of the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee. She's also co-chair of the Blue Dog Coalition, a member of the New Democrat Coalition, and co-chair of the New Democrat National Security Task Force. You've been a strong advocate of trade your whole time in office and talked, I know, about its importance to your district. But you also have a defense and national security background. I know you worked in the Defense Department before joining Congress, and you had actually served on the Armed Services Committee during your time in Congress. So you have a particularly good perch to talk about these issues. So over the past 3.5 years, we've seen the US relationship with many countries deteriorate. And trade has been a big part of that deterioration. We've seen, a wide range of tariffs imposed on many of our allies, causing those relationships to fray. Our relationship with China has moved to the brink of a Cold War. And I think these actions have led to a really challenging situation for the US, both in terms of trade, but also in terms of national security. So I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you today about that intersection. So can you talk a little bit about the role that trade plays in our national security and how these trade disputes have affected America's relationship with our allies and in the world more broadly?
Sure. Thanks so much, Rarit. And it's great to be with you. I also want to just thank Ken and Diego and WITA and ALI for hosting today. These conversations are so critically important, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the platform talking about this. But, you know, just as some framing remarks on that relationship in your question, you know, I'm somebody who thinks that trade on balance is good for our economy and for our workers. But we have to recognize that sometimes it does create domestic disruptions that we have to deal with in meaningful ways. And I'm not sure that, you know, the better we are at being able to deal with the domestic disruptions, the more space we have to engage in trade in a more robust way that benefits our economy. And I think those two things go hand in hand. And I also never am somebody who uses the term or say that I support simply free trade, because I think that suggests some sort of free for all. What I believe in is a trading system where we reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade, but where there are clear and fair rules and consequences for everybody, for all the countries that violate those rules. And if you have a trading system in which people are engaged in a rules-based trade, it's good for your economy, but trade is also good for our security. As you mentioned in your introduction of me, I've spent some time at the Department of Defense, and I think this is a really interesting or important element or role that trade plays. You know, people often talk about the tools of foreign policy, and the 3 Ds of foreign policy, and I add one more D. People talk about defense, diplomacy, and development aid. I add the idea of deals, and that's trade deals, because all 4 of those things are ways in which the U.S. can carry out our foreign policy. And unfortunately, I've seen this administration use national security as a guise for imposing tariffs all over the world, including on our allies, instead of using trade and trade measures to actually promote our national security. So what we've seen in this administration is that instead of working with our allies to confront China, which you know, violates a lot of the rules-based trading system, instead of working together with our allies to confront China, we've instead launched this multi-front tariff war. And it's hurt our international relationships, and it's harmed American consumers and domestic businesses. And so I'm not sure that in this administration, we've seen the best example of how you use trade to benefit our national security. And in fact, I think it's undercut us in a lot of ways. And then I think the final thing that I will say, just kind of looking forward a little bit, is I'm a little worried that given the experience that we're having with COVID, that the pre-existing anti-trade forces in the US and in other countries are going to be able to use COVID as a pretext for protectionism. And while I think, you know, without a doubt, we should not be too reliant on any country, especially China, and we've learned that, or that was underscored for us in this COVID crisis. I think the conversation that I'm hearing around trade has me a little bit worried about what the future of trade policy looks like for this country, as we might be overlearning the COVID lessons. I agree we need to diversify our supply chain, and that helps with our national security, domestic security. But diversification doesn't mean just domestication. You know, diversification means that we maybe work with our allies, have some domestication, but it's not all about creating a single point of failure here in the United States. So I think it's an interesting time for trade policy. and a critical time to have some leadership about the way forward and how to use trade to secure not just our domestic economy, but also our national security.
Thank you. And I definitely agree with you. And ALI has done a lot of work on the importance of really supporting domestic communities harmed with by trade. So I agree that's an important element. But just to kind of follow up on your last point for a moment. So, there have been, as you know, you mentioned a lot of import restrictions around PPE and other things in the name of, national security. How do we decide how should the US decide what products are considered national security items? How do we make those decisions, and how do we do that responsibly in a way that actually does support our national security, but to your point, doesn't just retreat into protectionism?
Well, as you know, this whole idea of supply chain disruption and product shortages as it relates to COVID has been a topic the Trade Subcommittee has been actively deliberating. And we've had a number of hearings and discussions with experts. And I'm not sure, even when you listen to those experts, that there's consensus as to which specific products should be considered national security or national health priorities. Clearly, when it comes to access to PPE and medical equipment and critical drugs, it's something that we're going to need a national strategy on. And that national strategy includes the incentivization and cultivation of domestic production, but it also may include working with our allies and trying to diversify our supply chain away from China or other areas where those countries may already be limiting exports. But I think, more broadly, when I hear people talking about limiting access to domestic production or placing export controls or using these tax incentives for domestic manufacturing, they talk about it across a pretty wide range of products and industries, not just the ones that are specific to our COVID response. And I think, while some of the shortages and the vulnerabilities in our ability to produce and procure and scale capacity in response to COVID has raised real questions about what we should always have access to. I do think there is, because it's not because some people are using a broader definition of what should be protected, we may find ourselves in a place where there's creep to include things under the national security guise that actually isn't a part of what should be considered as part of the national security. That's why it's so important to have a national strategy. And we've had a complete absence of that. It's been a free-for-all. The states have been told you're on your own to figure out what you're going to, what and how you're going to secure. And that's led to internal bidding wars. If we had a better national security plan, if we had a more, a better stocked national stockpile, those are all things that could have put us in a better situation than the one that we find ourselves in.
So I'm going to pull up a little bit to the bigger picture. I think, as the administration has withdrawn funding from the World Health Organization. We've blocked the appointment of judges to the WTO appellate body. And how have these I think that the U.S. is, I think ALI has always felt that global institutions have really kind of formed the backbone of our national security, going back to World War II. How have these actions actually impacted America's global standing and in turn our national security.
Yeah, it's been really disheartening to see what this administration has done to some of these international organizations. It is true that administrations, Democratic and Republican, have identified shortcomings or concerns with these organizations, but none has done as much to undermine the US's role within these organizations than this current administration. And it's really unfortunate since we spent a lot of national treasure and diplomatic capital trying to build and establish and lead and improve and evolve these international organizations so that we as a community of nations had a set of rules by which we could play and hold one another accountable, as opposed to reverting to conflict or armed conflict. It's preferable to be able to negotiate. I always think of this. When I first was elected to Congress, I took my kids, my son who was in kindergarten, and 12 of his buddies on a little DC tour. And I remember we walked down the mall. We got to the World War II memorial, and one of the kids said to me, Miss Stephanie, how come there isn't a World War III memorial? And I launched into this long answer similar to what I just said about, the importance of international organizations and, all the efforts the U.S. made in building these things called the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and such. And his mom rightly interrupted me and said, it's because the U.S. created places where people can use their words and not their fist. And I thought, well, that's probably more appropriate for a kindergartner, but that's exactly it, right? We created these places where nations could use their words instead of their fists. And with the U.S. Defunding the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic, that's just really hard to wrap your head around how that is strategic. Or with the WTO, as I mentioned, previous administrations had problems with it, but every previous administration made attempts to improve it, but none of them rendered the appellate body completely useless as this administration did last fall. And I think, we have to have a well-functioning set of international institutions. And in the trade space, if we don't, every trade dispute can devolve into a mini trade war with countries imposing tariffs and counter tariffs on each other. And I think as the world tries to recover from this economic crisis, the last thing we need is more taxes on businesses and consumers. So, my hope is that it's not too late for us to return to the table. The only way that we have a voice in these institutions and have the ability to make them better is to continue to have a seat at that table.
Yes. And then, just following on your point, I know that in many ways, China has really moved to fill the vacuum that the U.S. Has left in some of these organizations, and even a little more broadly in terms of giving a lot of aid to countries dealing with the pandemic, shipping masks, PPE, sending workers. How does that affect our national security, and is there still room for the U.S. to kind of reassert itself globally?
I would have to say that China is absolutely gleeful at the self-sabotaging efforts that the U.S. has engaged in as it relates to our standing in the international community and within international institutions. And I've been very clear about my concerns with the Chinese policy under President Xi, especially its foreign policy, its human rights record, its trade policy. And I think, watching the CCP's mishandling the COVID epidemic, what's going on in Xinjiang and in Hong Kong, all of the things of late, skirmishes along the China-India border, all of that has only made my concerns more intense. And I worry that the CCP is trying to use the distraction that's caused by the epidemic to advance its foreign policy objectives in ways that could undermine U.S. Interests and our allies' interests. And that's the reason why I introduced a Blue Dog Coalition endorsed bill this summer with Representatives Kendra Horn and Max Rose that would require the U.S. government to identify and combat efforts by the Chinese government to exploit the COVID pandemic. And what the bill would require is that the intelligence community would provide U.S. policymakers with an assessment of all the ways in which the Chinese government is using the pandemic to advance their goals. And then with this information, as lawmakers and as legislators, we'd have the ability to take actions to hold the Chinese government accountable and protect American interests. And I think, it's important that we understand that China engages in coercive diplomacy, and it's not doing anything altruistically. There's not a benevolent, motivation behind whether it's the aid that they're providing or otherwise. And China thinks in the very long term. And I bet you they look at this moment as an opportunity to advance their national interest at the expense of America and its allies. And for us as a country, we have to take a very clear-eyed look at that and do what we can in conjunction with our allies to prevent that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's worrisome. So just continuing on the discussion of China for the moment, which is obviously a topic that looms large when we talk about national security. So there's, as you know, obviously the committee has had numerous hearings about Huawei, ZTE, other China technology companies, and the administration has really imposed a whole series of restrictions on their ability to sell their products in the US, and in May went a step further, barring Huawei and its suppliers from using US technology and software. So I think that everyone agrees we need strong measures to protect US technology, US safety. I think the struggle that many people are trying to think through is how far should these restrictions go to protect our national security. But, I think, at least not go to a complete decoupling, which probably isn't in our national interest. How do we think about how we, in fact, protect our national security, where that line is, and manage our technology relationship?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is that when it comes to technology, we are at a moment where it is two competing approaches to technology, in that the US's technology has always been technology built with a democratizing intent and democratizing value. I mean, if you think of the things that the US has led the world in, it's enabled small businesses to reach more customers. It's enabled greater access to media and information. We have in our products are our values. And then I look at China and the products and the way that they've implemented technology, and their technology is about an autocratic, dystopian kind of technology. And you look no further than Xinjiang or Hong Kong to see uses of that technology. It's very, very different than the approach that we have. And so going back to one of the points we made earlier about the US stepping away from international institutions and engaging the world, we have for decades set the technology standards for the world, because we were not only the largest consumer, but also the greatest innovator of technology. And so those standards met and matched our values. But as we step away from that table, it gives space for this autocratic approach to technology to take hold. And China is at the table still. And they're pushing their technologies that have backdoors, that have the ability for government access, that are meant for government control of its citizens. So this is a real problem for us, because if we want the world to continue to have tech standards that embody our democratic values, we've got to be at that table fighting for that. And we have to be engaged in trade and enable our tech companies to continue to have the strategic advantages that have made them leaders in this space. So that's sort of at the macro level what I think, is important that we do in this competition between democratic technology and autocratic technology. But I think the other thing we have to do too is we have to recognize, as we compete in this area, that we don't want to make China into some sort of cartoon villain, China good, China bad, right? There are a lot of ways in which, while we need to check them in some areas, we can cooperate in others. But what's happening politically, domestically, is tying our hands a little bit, because the issue of China policy has become very politicized. And I like to call it the new McCarthy era of the Red Scare. In this current campaign season, the Republicans love to, claim that a Democrat is somehow too close to China or a socialist. And what making our approach to China polarized and partisan like that does is it undermines our national security and our ability to advance American interests in a way that sees China in a clear-eyed way, and that allows us to have measured policies and allows us to work with our allies and have a reasonable approach. The last McCarthy era resulted in a lot of ruined careers and a weakening of US interests vis-a-vis communism. And I certainly hope we're not repeating that mistake, especially at this critical moment where we're having this struggle between our two different visions for the world.
Yeah, I know that, how to deal with I like the way you frame the dichotomy of democratic technology versus autocratic technology. And that's something that we're doing a lot of work on as well, is how do we kind of assert American standards. It's not an easy challenge. So the US, as you know, withdrew from TPP about 3.5 years ago, and those countries have moved forward on our own. And then there's with the CPTPP, but then there's also RCEP, which is the trade agreement that includes China. I think TPP was originally envisioned as one way, in fact, to quote, address, or contain some of the China issues. Wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what we've lost.
Yeah, you're right. TPP was envisioned as a way for us to establish our presence in the Asia-Pacific region and to be a counterbalance to China. I've always said that our presence in the Asia-Pacific cannot be just in the form of the Seventh Fleet. Economic ties enable us to have a different and more nuanced relationship in the region, and to ensure that there's relative peace and security and stability in the region, which is critically important when you think about, the presence of North Korea in that region. And, it's a perennial challenge. And unfortunately, this administration hasn't done anything to advance our efforts to keep North Korea from developing nuclear weapons and the missiles to deliver them, and threaten the region and global security. There continue to be major territorial disputes between China and its neighbors, and it's our presence there. If what is the saying? If the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. And that's why, we can't just be in the region in the form of the Seventh Fleet, right? Being in the region, engaged in the region, through economic ties is critically important. What really is amazing to me is that I think that unilateral withdrawal from TPP was a serious error. It not only has economic ramifications, but also strategic ones. And we had an opportunity with TPP to unify the region around an American designed system of commerce. And unfortunately, we've squandered that opportunity. And what I was going to say is amazing to me is now I hear the USTR complaining that Japan has preferential relationships with other countries that are better than the one that they have with us and undercuts our supplier, our producers. And I'm like, well, dude, it's because they're a part of CPTPP and we chose not to have those. I mean, we walked away from that. So what are you complaining about? I mean, this is a direct result of the decision to walk away from TPP. And so now we're in the region trying to do these one-off bilats, and of the bilats that I wouldn't even call them a bilat, because what we negotiated with Japan, while an important step in the right direction, is what they're calling the mini deal. What is in that mini deal does not rise to the level of sophistication that a deal between two closely knit allies with shared democratic values and similar economies are worth. That is unworthy of the relationship we have with Japan to have just some sort of mini deal. We should have a comprehensive deal. So, a multilateral TPP deal would have been best. Second best is a comprehensive bilateral deal. And yet what we have are incomplete mini deals. It's substandard for everybody. And not only is it bad for our economy, it's bad for our national security and then global or regional stability.
Thank you. Well, I have quite a few more questions I could be asking, but I know that we have a list of questions from the audience. So I think Ken would like to start giving them a chance.
Well, thank you, Orit, for that chance. We do have some questions that have come in from our audience, and we could, if anyone has any more, please send them our way. There are actually some good questions on topics you'll probably be addressing in the Ways and Means Committee in the weeks to come. First one is a question about the reauthorization of Trade Promotion Authority. How do you see that playing out over the next few months? Obviously, there's an election coming up as well.
Well, I think if one thing the Trump administration has done well in the trade space is to remind Congress and the country how important it is to have congressional input. Just take, for example, our ability to make USMCA better. And USMCA required congressional approval because of some of the rules in TPA. And I think that made it a better trade deal for American producers and American consumers. And unfortunately, some of the other things that the Trump administration is advancing in the trade space, they're doing so that it falls below what is required in TPA. And I think, as I've mentioned in previous questions, that's not yielding the best result for American businesses and American consumers. So, congressional engagement is critical. As a House member, I'm closest to my businesses and my workers who are affected by trade policies. I should have an opportunity to provide input into the trade deals. And currently, the relationship between the administration and Congress is a bit out of balance. And I think both parties in both chambers should be interested in having TPA adjustments regardless of who wins in November. My hope is that we begin those conversations soon, but my experience is that with Congress, they rarely do things until it's the last minute. I used to teach at a local liberal arts college. And if I were grading Congress, these are the kids who wrote their exam papers the night before, and you can always tell sloppy work. And in trade, we deserve more than that. So I really hope that TPA starts to get real attention, and we start to outline what we think that relationship between Congress and the White House looks like, irrespective of who's sitting in the White House.
As someone who is often a deadline meter, I actually thought I did some of my best work on deadline, but I can certainly appreciate the perspective when you're making laws, and what's the expression, making sausages is not something that's often pretty either, and rushing the process certainly wouldn't be either. So a couple more questions. One comes in about, I think, a hearing you're having coming about Caribbean Basin Partnership. Do you think it'll get passed before it expires? And any additional thoughts about GSP and the USTR, the Trump administration, somewhat ambivalence about GSP. Do you think that's going to cause any problems with renewal of that as well?
Well, we are having that trade hearing tomorrow, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation and the testimony. You know, I think the CVTPA has bipartisan support, and it's going through the proper legislative process. So, you know, we do have the rest of the month to try to get it done before expiration, and so fingers crossed there. I'm hopeful. As to you know, GSP. You know, I know that USTR has a very specific perspective on GSP, and that's important, but I think Congress will move forward with our approach, and hopefully the administration will agree.
Great. So the next question comes in on a topic that's been getting a lot of attention over the last 6 months, especially. It has to do with Buy America provisions. It's been at forefront of some discussions. Certainly the administration has used it with COVID, but it's also something that they've talked about with their trade policy. It's come up in from some of the Democratic side of the aisle as well. Do you think that's something, can you share thoughts about use of the Buy America provision, and also kind of the nexus with some of our trade agreements? We just have a new USMCA with Canada. We've just put on renewed aluminum tariffs on Canada. We went into force on USMCA July 1st, new tariffs in August on aluminum. The Buy America provisions are always churning out there, and we have these trade agreements, with Canada and with other countries. Just share your thoughts on kind of both of those things. That would be helpful.
Yeah, I mean, while I agree kind of, generally that government procurement could have different priorities, given sometimes government procurement has a national security impact, depending if it's for defense or other areas. So it could have different priorities. And I think always we should try to support American businesses where possible. But the reality is that we do trade deals for a reason. It's to set the rules of the road between us and our closest trading partners. And so we should be mindful of not introducing externalities to already agreed upon trade deals that would harm that trade relationship. And, I think if we wanted to review our trade relationship with our allies and look specifically at that should have been included in the broader deal. USMCA hasn't really been given an opportunity to go into force, for us to even see whether or not, it works as we intended. And so I think it needs to be given the opportunity to do that before we add anything further to undercut our trading relationship and the deal that we already signed and put a lot of effort into making. The other thing is that you have to think about, well, why bother going through for our allies or our trading partners, why bother going through this onerous process of negotiating trade deals only to find yourself almost immediately, not at being treated in a way that isn't consistent with the trade deal that you just inked. It undermines our credibility as we go out there and try to get others to negotiate with us when they see us treating our closest allies and neighbors this way.
Reed, I think you were mentioning that you indicated you may want to jump in. Oh, we lost Reed. I don't know what just happened. So it's just me and you for a minute. Hopefully Reed will jump back on. I think she may have hit the wrong button on her computer. So another question we have is about the WTO. The Director General, as you may know, Acevedo, is leaving this month, and they're selecting a new Director General. Do you have any thoughts on what should be the U.S. priorities in a new Director General candidate?
Yeah, I think this is a really important decision, I guess, to make. It's important to get this right at a time where, you know, the future of the WTO and the U.S. role within it is it's a critical moment for all of that. I think they have an impressive list of candidates, and you know, I'm looking forward to seeing who will emerge from that. But yeah, it's going to be a tough decision, but it's not a decision for the U.S. alone. So, but I am glad to see a list of very qualified candidates.
All right, I think Orit's coming back in. This is the vagaries of doing these Zoom sessions. Sorry we lost you there for a second, Orit, but I know you wanted to, you had a question yourself about GSP you wanted to follow up on. I'm sorry, Buy America.
Yeah, so, and sorry, my computer cut me off for a second. You know, my question is really about subsidies. And, you know, I think one thing we've seen is, you know, and this is related to Buy America, you know, increased interest in propping up US companies in various ways, supporting US competitiveness, which is, you know, not all bad. But, you know, there's legislation to support semiconductors. There's certainly been a lot of interest and support for a lot of pharma companies. And, you know, and this could, I've heard a lot of people say this could go much more broadly as we become more concerned about American competitiveness. How does this affect our ability to deal with China's subsidies and, you know, the desire to negotiate a new subsidies agreement in the WTO?
Yeah, you're right. It is a difficult situation because we do want to help American producers and American industry, but you know, you can't on the one hand provide these sort of subsidies and then also chastise others to not do what we aren't doing. It's a bit hypocritical. And I think one of the ways in which we can support our industries in a way that isn't about subsidies is to provide quality education, training in those industries that we want to lead in, creating a regulatory environment that allows them to flourish. There are so many ways in which we can support and grow our industries. And I always find that people who have protectionist tendencies are people who don't have faith in the American worker. And for me, I have faith in the American worker. If you give an American worker, an American company, a level playing field, we will beat any other competitor. I'm that certain about that. And I think that there are a lot of ways in which we can support industries that are important to us without reverting to these trade practices that we don't want to see other countries use and that undermine the concept of a rules-based trading system. You know, we don't want to devolve into the kind of trading system we had over 100 years ago, where it's, you know, about just protectionist activities, unfair trading rules. And it goes back to also to have a well-functioning WTO so that we have very clear rules of the road that everyone can follow, and then there are enforcement mechanisms when people don't follow those rules. But we have to be at that table and showing leadership, not withdrawing, crying foul, and then reverting to the same bad practices that we are complaining about other people.
we are at our bewitching hour, but I would like to ask you one more question that came in. It's really a front burner issue, and it goes directly back to your national security background, and it has to do with the whole question of Chinese technology, investment, the nexus with trade policy. I just want to share some thoughts about your thoughts on how we should be viewing. It's not even just the competition with China, because this isn't really a trade issue per se. It's not a competitiveness question for the United States. It's a security issue. Huawei, the certain ZTE, they've all been in the news, and they're all still happening. Your thoughts on how we should be looking at those issues. I know it's not a partisan issue in general for those either. That's something both Democrats and Republicans have a lot of concern about.
Yeah, it is a complicated issue that requires a bit more strategic thinking than what we've seen to date. So, for example, with Huawei or ZTE, we have demanded that our allies not purchase those products, but we haven't really given them an alternative. Same with our own domestic companies. So it's not a complete strategy, right? You can't say, those things are forbidden and not provide a valid alternative. The threats are very real. The national security threats, the data and privacy issues, and all of those are very real threats. But we have to understand that every sovereign nation has to make decisions that are right for them, given the range of options that they are given. And so when we say, you have to take one set of options off the table, we should probably also provide some alternatives, because we're putting people in a rock and a hard spot kind of situation. And given that we have close intel and security relationships with some of these allies that are in a tough spot, it's hard to unwind all of those things. And so I think we have to have a more strategic approach and be more deliberate. And the other thing too is that because this administration has abused the term national security in the trade space, and also has been derisive of our own intel, it's hard to convince our allies to follow our lead on this. When sometimes our own administration doesn't believe our intel community, how can we go to our allies and say, hey, we have intel that says, X, Y, or Z, we need you to, put yourself at your own nation at some economic or otherwise disadvantage. But trust us, because in this case, we believe our intel. But, so there is a consequence with the looseness with which this administration has dealt with national security issues. And I wouldn't blame our allies for, thinking twice about following our lead, given the way that we have used national security as a rationale for calling some of these exact allies a threat, have been dismissive of our own intel. It is a very discordant and approach. And one thing I think is really concerning, though, is by having this sort of chaotic administration, we are undercutting our ability to lead. There may have been a time when our allies would have been like, oh, okay, well, this is important to us, it matters to us, and you're a good ally and we can trust you, and it's predictable. And I wonder if they still feel that way, given all that's happened over the last few years. And that will come around to creating vulnerabilities in our own national security.
We have a lot to repair.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really appreciated the conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great to have this conversation with you all, and I hope you stay safe, be well, and thanks to everybody who joined us today.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Thank you, Ori. Really grateful. Hope to have you back again, maybe live at a live in-person event at WITA when it's safe to do so. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. We hope you'll join us tomorrow with Pascal Lamy and Bob Zellick and for our upcoming events. Thank you so much again, Ori and Congressman Murphy. Thank you very much. Be safe, stay well, and everybody out there, wear a mask. Thanks. Bye-bye.